When 19-year-old Sarah visits her aunt, she's drawn into the mysterious world of Oliver Pierce, a wealthy and reclusive artist haunted by his past. What begins as a fascination with his art soon turns into a dangerous affair that threatens to destroy everything. As their scandalous romance deepens, shocking consequences emerge, forcing Sarah and Oliver to face a devastating truth. It was late summer when Sarah made her way to the edge of town, to the grand yet solitary estate where her Aunt Linda worked as a caretaker. The large mansion loomed ahead, perched on the cliffs overlooking the sea. Sarah hadn't seen her aunt in months, and the excuse of a summer break from college seemed like a good opportunity for a visit. But as she stepped out of the taxi and approached the front door, she couldn't help but feel a growing sense of curiosity. Her aunt had always been vague about her job and the man she worked for, Oliver Pierce. "Come on in, Sarah." Aunt Linda greeted her with a warm smile as she opened the heavy door. "I'm glad you came. It's been too long." The inside of the house was just as grand as she imagined, with tall ceilings and walls lined with paintings that seemed to watch her every move. Aunt Linda gave her a quick tour, avoiding a few closed doors, particularly one at the end of a long hallway. "This place is huge," Sarah said, her voice echoing slightly in the high-ceilinged foyer. "It is," Linda replied with a chuckle, "but most of it isn't used. Just me, the staff, and Mr. Pierce." "And what's he like?" Sarah asked, hoping her question didn't seem too prying. Aunt Linda hesitated, her expression clouding for a moment. "Oliver, he's a private man. Keeps to himself mostly. He's a talented artist, but, well, he's been through a lot." That was the most her aunt offered, leaving Sarah to fill in the gaps herself. The mystery surrounding Oliver Pierce intrigued her. A reclusive artist? There had to be a story there. Later that evening, as Sarah wandered through the house, she found herself drawn to the artwork. Landscapes, still lives, and portraits filled the walls, but one painting in particular caught her attention. It was a portrait of a woman, beautiful, with soft features and a melancholy expression. Her hair was auburn, her eyes deep and haunting. The strange thing was, the woman in the painting bore a striking resemblance to Sarah herself. Before she could linger too long on the thought, a voice startled her. "I see you found my favorite piece." She spun around to find a man standing in the doorway. He was tall, with dark hair streaked with gray at the temples, his eyes sharp and distant. This was Oliver Pierce. His presence filled the room, but there was a weight to him, like someone who carried a great deal of unspoken pain. "I'm sorry," Sarah stammered. "I didn't mean to intrude." Oliver's gaze lingered on the painting for a moment before turning back to her. "It's fine. I don't mind people appreciating my work, as long as they respect it." There was a pause, and Sarah felt an inexplicable urge to ask about the painting, about the woman. But something held her back, a sense that the subject might be too personal. "Instead," she said, "it's beautiful." Oliver nodded slightly. "Thank you." He looked at her again, this time more intently. "You remind me of her." The way he said it sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. Before she could ask him what he meant, he turned and left the room without another word. That night, Sarah lay awake in the guest room, staring at the ceiling. There was something about Oliver that she couldn't shake. Who was the woman in the painting, and why did she look so much like her? More importantly, what had happened in this house that had made Oliver Pierce into the man he was now? The next few days passed in a blur of awkward interactions. Sarah spent most of her time exploring the house and the grounds, finding herself more and more drawn to Oliver's world of art. Occasionally, she would catch a glimpse of him at work in his studio, through the half-open door. The space was filled with canvases, some half-finished, others covered with sheets, as if hiding something too painful to look at. It wasn't until the end of the week that they spoke again. Sarah had wandered into the studio, unable to resist the pull of curiosity any longer. She found Oliver standing before a large canvas, his back to her, lost in concentration. "You shouldn't be in here," he said without turning around, but his voice lacked the sharpness she expected. I was just curious," Sarah admitted. "Your work is amazing." He was silent for a moment, and then, to her surprise, he stepped aside, allowing her a better view of the painting. It was another portrait, this one of a younger version of the woman from before. Her eyes were filled with life, her smile gentle. It was almost as if she was looking directly at Sarah, knowing something she didn't. "Who is she?" Sarah asked softly, not sure if she wanted to know the answer. Oliver sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "My wife. She died. A long time ago." Sarah felt a pang of guilt for asking, but before she could apologize, Oliver turned to her. There was something different in his eyes now, a vulnerability that hadn't been there before. "You remind me of her," he repeated, but this time his voice was softer, almost sad. Sarah didn't know what to say. There was so much she wanted to ask, so much she didn't understand, but the weight of his grief was palpable. Instead, she stood there in silence, the two of them surrounded by his art, by the remnants of a life that had been shattered. As the days went on, Sarah's curiosity only deepened. She began to spend more time in Oliver's studio, drawn to his world in a way she couldn't quite explain. Each time she visited, she felt the pull between them grow stronger, like there was something beneath the surface waiting to be uncovered. And she wasn't sure if she was ready to face it. Sarah's visits to Oliver's studio became more frequent as the days stretched into weeks. It started innocently enough, her fascination with his art, her curiosity about the woman in the portraits. But slowly, something deeper began to develop between them, an unspoken connection that neither of them could deny. Each day, Sarah found herself lingering longer in the studio, watching Oliver work in silence. He seemed to welcome her presence, even if he rarely spoke about his art or his past. Instead, their conversations began to shift towards lighter topics, books, music, their thoughts on life. And every so often, Sarah would catch him looking at her with that same curious intensity, as if he was trying to figure something out. One afternoon, while Oliver was mixing paint, Sarah couldn't help but break the silence. "You're different when you paint." Oliver raised an eyebrow, but didn't stop his work. "How so?" "You seem calmer, more at ease," she replied, watching him brush the paint onto the canvas with smooth, deliberate strokes. "Like you're in control here." He paused, his eyes still focused on the canvas in front of him. "Art's the only thing I can control." There was a weight to his words, and Sarah sensed there was more he wasn't saying. "What do you mean?" Oliver hesitated, as if debating whether or not to let her in. "When my wife died, I lost control of everything. My life, my emotions, it all slipped away. Painting was the only thing that kept me grounded." Sarah swallowed, unsure of how to respond. She could see the pain in his eyes, the lingering grief that clung to him like a shadow. And yet, beneath that, there was something else, something vulnerable, something human. "I'm sorry," she said softly, feeling the depth of his sadness. For the first time, Oliver looked at her directly, his gaze piercing. "Don't be. It was a long time ago." But Sarah could tell that time hadn't healed the wound. It was still there, raw and open, just beneath the surface. As the weeks passed, their connection grew stronger. What started as simple conversations about art turned into deeper discussions about life and loss. Oliver began to share more about his wife, though always in fragments. Her name was Lily, and she had been his muse for many years. They had met when he was just starting out as an artist, and she had been his inspiration, his reason for painting. "I didn't paint anything after she died," Oliver admitted one evening, his voice low. "I couldn't. It felt wrong, like a betrayal." Sarah didn't know what to say. She couldn't imagine the weight of that kind of grief, the kind that could take away something as essential as creating art. "What made you start again?" she asked gently, curious about what had pulled him out of that darkness. He looked at her for a long moment before answering. "I'm not sure. Maybe I thought it was the only way to keep her alive." Sarah felt her heart tighten at his words. The love he had for his wife was still so present, even after all these years. It made her wonder if she would ever find something like that, something so powerful, so consuming. But as the days went on, Sarah couldn't ignore the way her own feelings were starting to change. She found herself thinking about Oliver more than she wanted to admit, her thoughts drifting back to him even when she wasn't in the studio. There was something about him that drew her in, a quiet intensity, a mystery that made her want to know him more. even if it meant uncovering the pain he carried with him. And she could feel that he was starting to open up to her as well. The way he looked at her, the way his eyes lingered a little longer than they should. There was something there, something unspoken. One evening, as the sun set outside the studio, casting a warm glow over the room, Oliver finally asked the question that had been hanging between them for days. "Why do you keep coming back?" he asked, his voice soft but filled with meaning. Sarah blinked, caught off guard by the question. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I guess. I like being here. With you." Oliver's gaze softened, and for a moment, there was no distance between them, no walls. Just two people, standing in the quiet of his studio, both of them carrying their own scars. "I like having you here," he said, his voice low, almost hesitant, as if he was revealing a part of himself he hadn't shown to anyone in a long time. Sarah's heart skipped a beat, and she suddenly felt the weight of their connection pressing down on her. She hadn't expected to feel this way, not about him, not about anyone. And yet, here she was, standing in front of a man who was old enough to have lived through things she couldn't imagine, and she was drawn to him in a way she couldn't explain. That night, when she returned to her room, Sarah lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Her mind raced with thoughts of Oliver, of the way he looked at her, the way he seemed to understand her in a way no one else did. She couldn't help but wonder if he felt the same pull, if he was just as conflicted as she was. The next morning, when she went to the studio, something had shifted. There was a tension in the air, something that hadn't been there before. Oliver seemed distracted, his hands moving nervously as he worked on a new painting. Sarah stood by the door, unsure of whether she should stay or leave. But before she could make a decision, Oliver spoke. "I've been thinking about you," he said, not turning around. "More than I should." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't sure what to say, what to do. The truth was, she had been thinking about him too, in ways that made her feel guilty, conflicted. "Oliver," she started, but he interrupted her. "I know it's wrong," he said quickly, turning to face her. "I know I shouldn't feel this way, but I do." His confession hung in the air between them, heavy and undeniable. Sarah could feel the weight of it pressing down on her, the intensity of his words sinking into her skin. For a long moment, they stood in silence, neither of them knowing what to say. But then, slowly, Oliver took a step toward her, his gaze never leaving hers. He reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Tell me to stop," he whispered, his voice hoarse, filled with emotion. But Sarah couldn't. She didn't want him to stop. Before she could say anything, Oliver leaned in and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as if they were both afraid of what it might mean. But then it deepened, and all the tension, all the unspoken feelings between them, spilled out in that moment. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing heavily, their foreheads resting against each other. "I shouldn't have done that," Oliver said, his voice filled with regret. Sarah shook her head. "No, you should have." The kiss changed everything. From that moment on, Sarah and Oliver found themselves crossing lines they had never intended to. What began as curiosity, admiration, and a strange attraction had blossomed into something deeper, more dangerous. They both knew it, but neither could bring themselves to stop. Their connection, now undeniable, ignited a secret romance. The thrill of it, the secrecy, made every touch and every whispered word more intoxicating. But beneath the surface, both of them knew there was a darkness to what they were doing, an awareness that their relationship wasn't just unusual, but forbidden. A few days after that first kiss, they found themselves in the studio again, this time in the dim light of the late evening. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving only the soft glow of a lamp in the corner. Oliver was painting, but his attention wasn't fully on the canvas. He glanced at Sarah more often than usual, his eyes following her movements as she paced the room. "You're nervous," he said, finally breaking the silence. Sarah stopped and looked at him. "Shouldn't I be?" He put down his brush, wiping his hands on a rag as he turned toward her. "Maybe," he admitted. "But this, whatever this is, feels too good to stop." She couldn't disagree. The weight of their shared secret pressed down on her every moment she wasn't with him. But when they were together, it was as if nothing else mattered. In the quiet of the studio, they could pretend there was no past, no consequences, just the two of them and the connection they couldn't deny. "Oliver," Sarah said quietly, stepping closer. "What are we doing?" Oliver sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Something we shouldn't be," he confessed. "But I don't want to stop." His honesty cut through the tension between them. Sarah felt it too. The pull between them was undeniable. But every time she thought about her aunt, about what people would think, a wave of guilt crashed over her. "What about my aunt?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "She trusts me." "She trusts you." Oliver's face tightened. "I know. I've thought about it every day since we started this. But Sarah, I can't help how I feel about you." His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of the truth. Sarah felt her heart pounding in her chest. It would have been easier if he had lied, if he had pretended this was just some fleeting attraction. But it wasn't. She could feel it in every glance, every touch. They were both in too deep now. That night, their relationship took another step into dangerous territory. It wasn't just about stolen kisses anymore. In the shadows of the studio, surrounded by the remnants of Oliver's past, they crossed the line completely. Their shared desire consumed them, pulling them into something that felt too powerful to resist. Afterward, as they lay together on the couch in the corner of the studio, the room still smelling of paint and canvas, the guilt began to creep back in. Sarah stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. What were they doing? How long could this last before someone found out? "I feel like I'm betraying everyone," she whispered. Oliver, lying beside her, turned his head to look at her. "You're not," he said softly. "You're just following what feels right." "But it doesn't feel right," she replied, sitting up. It feels dangerous." Oliver sat up too, his hand brushing against hers. "I won't hurt you, Sarah." She believed him, but that wasn't the point. The danger wasn't in Oliver's intentions. It was in everything else. The secret meetings, the lies by omission, the inevitable discovery that would shatter the fragile peace they had created. "We can't keep doing this," she said, but even as she spoke the words, she knew she didn't want to stop. Oliver didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached out and pulled her into his arms, holding her close. His embrace was warm, comforting, and for a moment, all the fear and guilt melted away. "We'll figure it out," he whispered into her hair. "We'll find a way to make this work." But deep down, Sarah knew it wouldn't be that simple. As the days passed, their secret affair intensified. They met whenever they could, sneaking away to the studio or hidden corners of the estate. Every moment alone felt like stolen time, borrowed from a future they couldn't quite grasp. During the day, Sarah tried to act normal around her aunt, but it became harder with each passing day. Linda, as perceptive as ever, began to notice the changes in her niece's behavior. Sarah was distracted, her thoughts often drifting during conversations, and her eyes always seemed to linger a little too long on Oliver whenever he was nearby. "Are you all right, Sarah?" Linda asked one evening over dinner. "You've been acting different." Sarah nearly choked on her food, forcing a smile as she quickly composed herself. "I'm fine, Aunt Linda. Just, adjusting to being away from school." Linda gave her a skeptical look, but didn't press further. Still, the question lingered in the air, making Sarah's stomach twist with guilt. Every moment she spent with Oliver felt like a betrayal, not just of her aunt, but of something deeper, something she couldn't quite name. One evening, as Sarah slipped out of her room to meet Oliver in the studio, she felt the weight of what they were doing pressing down harder than ever. The house was quiet, the only sound the soft creaking of the old floorboards beneath her feet. She found Oliver waiting for her, as he always was, but tonight there was something different in his expression, something more intense. Without a word, he pulled her into his arms, kissing her fiercely, as if he was trying to drown out all the doubts, all the fears that had been building between them. Sarah responded just as urgently, caught up in the whirlwind of emotions that had consumed them both. But afterward, as they lay together in the dim light of the studio, the reality of their situation came crashing down once again. "We can't keep this secret forever," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of her guilt. "Someone's going to find out." Oliver didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached out, brushing his fingers through her hair. "I know," he said finally, his voice heavy with resignation, "but I don't know how to stop." Neither did she. Over the next few weeks, the tension grew. Their secret meetings became riskier, each one filled with the looming threat of discovery. Sarah found herself lying awake at night, consumed by the fear of what would happen if her aunt found out, if anyone found out. And yet, she couldn't stop. Every time she told herself it would be the last, she found herself back in Oliver's arms, losing herself in the intensity of their forbidden romance. But the guilt was starting to eat away at both of them. It was there in the quiet moments when they weren't touching, when the reality of what they were doing seeped into the spaces between their words. One evening, as they sat in the studio, the weight of their actions became too much to ignore. "We need to stop," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Oliver's eyes met hers, filled with a mix of longing and regret. "Do you really want to stop?" Sarah didn't answer, because the truth was, she didn't. But she knew they couldn't keep living in this fantasy. Sooner or later, it would all come crashing down around them, and she wasn't sure either of them would survive the fallout. The storm that Sarah had feared for weeks finally began to gather, dark clouds forming overhead, though the skies above the estate remained deceptively clear. Everything seemed the same on the surface: her secret meetings with Oliver, the stolen glances, the whispered conversations. But something had shifted inside her, and it was something she could no longer ignore. It started with a slight nausea in the mornings, the kind she brushed off as nothing. She hadn't been sleeping well, constantly haunted by her own guilt and the fear of being discovered. But then the nausea didn't go away. It came and went in waves, stronger each time, until she could no longer pretend it was just nerves. One morning, when she woke up feeling unusually weak and lightheaded, Sarah stared at herself in the bathroom mirror, her skin pale and clammy. She knew. Even before she took the test, some part of her had already known. Her hands shook as she waited for the results, staring at the stick on the counter, willing it to say something different than what she feared. When the two lines appeared, confirming what she had been dreading, Sarah felt the world fall out from under her. Pregnant. She was pregnant with Oliver's child. The room felt like it was closing in on her, the walls pressing closer as panic set in. She stumbled out of the bathroom, clutching her stomach as if the realization would somehow make it go away. But it didn't. It was real. This was happening. For hours, Sarah sat on her bed, numb and unable to think clearly. What was she going to do? How could she possibly face this? Her mind raced through the implications. Her aunt, her family, Oliver. Especially Oliver. What would he say? Would he even want this? The weight of it all was crushing. She hadn't told anyone about her relationship with Oliver, and now? This? It felt like too much to handle. She was just 19, still trying to figure out her life. And now it was spiraling out of control. The first person she told wasn't Oliver. It was her aunt, Linda. That evening, Sarah found her aunt in the kitchen, preparing dinner, as she often did after a long day of work. The smell of food filled the air, but Sarah barely noticed it. Her heart was pounding in her chest, her mouth dry. She stood in the doorway, watching her aunt for a moment, trying to gather the courage to speak. Finally, she forced the words out. "Aunt Linda, I need to tell you something." Linda looked up, wiping her hands on a towel, a warm smile on her face. "What is it, honey?" Sarah's throat felt tight, her stomach twisting into knots. I'm pregnant." The smile faded from Linda's face in an instant, replaced by shock and concern. "What? Sarah, are you sure?" Sarah nodded, feeling the weight of her aunt's stare. "I took the test this morning. It's positive." For a moment, Linda didn't say anything, just stood there, processing the news. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, filled with a sadness that pierced Sarah's heart. "Oh, Sarah, how could this happen?" Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I swear, I didn't." Linda closed the distance between them, pulling Sarah into a tight embrace. "Sure, I know. I know you didn't, she whispered, stroking Sarah's hair, but the warmth of her comfort only lasted a moment before reality set in. Linda pulled back, her face a mix of concern and confusion. Who's the father? The question hung in the air like a loaded gun. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, she couldn't bring herself to say it. But she knew she had to. There was no hiding it now. It's Oliver, she finally confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. Linda's expression shifted from concern to disbelief, and then to something deeper, betrayal. She took a step back, her hands shaking as she pressed them to her mouth. Oliver, she repeated, as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. Sarah, please tell me this is some kind of mistake. Sarah shook her head, the tears spilling over now. I'm sorry, Aunt Linda. I didn't mean for it to happen, but it did. For a long moment, Linda didn't speak. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. When she finally did, her voice was cold, tinged with anger and heartbreak. How could you do this, Sarah? How could you with him? I didn't plan it, Sarah said, her voice cracking with emotion. It just happened. I know it's wrong, but I can't change what's done. Linda turned away, her hands gripping the edge of the kitchen counter, as if she needed to hold onto something to keep herself from falling apart. I trusted you, she whispered, her voice trembling. I trusted him. Sarah felt her chest tighten with guilt. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you. But her words felt hollow, inadequate. The damage was already done. There was no way to take it back now. Later that night, after Linda had retreated to her room in stunned silence, Sarah knew she had to face Oliver. She couldn't hide this from him. He had a right to know, even if she wasn't sure how he would react. When she knocked on the door to his studio, Oliver was there, his back to her as he worked on yet another canvas. The smell of paint and turpentine filled the room, familiar and oddly comforting. He didn't turn around when she entered, but he must have sensed something was wrong. Sarah? He asked, his voice low and rough. What's going on? Sarah swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. Oliver, I need to talk to you. He turned then, his eyes meeting hers with concern. He set down his brush, stepping toward her. What is it? I'm pregnant, she said, her voice shaking. The words seemed to hang in the air between them, heavy and suffocating. Oliver stared at her, unblinking, as if he hadn't heard her correctly. What? I'm pregnant, she repeated, this time barely able to hold back the tears. It's yours. Oliver's face went pale, the color draining from his skin as the reality of her words sank in. He stumbled back a step, his hand coming up to run through his hair. For a long moment, he didn't speak, his eyes wide with shock. I don't know what to say, he finally muttered, his voice hoarse. How? It just happened, Sarah said, her voice trembling. I wasn't expecting this either, Oliver. But it's real. Oliver's eyes darkened with something Sarah couldn't quite place. Fear, guilt, maybe even anger. This changes everything, he whispered, almost to himself. Sarah nodded, wiping at her tears. I know. Oliver turned away, pacing the length of the studio, his hands clenched into fists. I thought we were being careful. How could this happen? I don't know, Sarah whispered, her voice filled with regret. But it did. For a moment, it seemed like Oliver might explode, his emotions too raw to contain. But then, just as suddenly, he seemed to deflate, sinking into one of the chairs by the window. He buried his face in his hands, taking deep, ragged breaths. What are we going to do? He asked, his voice muffled. Sarah didn't know. She had no idea what the future held, or how they could possibly navigate the mess they had created. But she knew one thing for certain. They couldn't keep this secret forever. I don't know, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. But we'll figure it out. We have to. Oliver looked up at her then, his face filled with a sadness she hadn't seen before. I never wanted to bring a child into this chaos. I'm not ready for this, Sarah. His words stung, but Sarah understood. She wasn't ready either. But the reality was, they didn't have a choice. The child growing inside her was real, and they had to deal with it. I know, she said softly, moving closer to him, but we'll get through this. Somehow. Oliver didn't respond. He just stared out the window, lost in thought, as if the weight of the world had suddenly fallen onto his shoulders. The days that followed were filled with tension. Oliver withdrew into himself, spending hours locked away in the studio, while Sarah struggled to cope with the overwhelming reality of her pregnancy. Linda, heartbroken and betrayed, barely spoke to either of them, her presence in the house a constant reminder of the damage that had been done. Sarah's health began to suffer under the stress. She felt constantly drained, her energy slipping away as the weight of her situation grew heavier with each passing day. One morning, she nearly collapsed while getting out of bed, and it was only then that Linda, despite her pain, insisted she see a doctor. The doctor's visit confirmed what Sarah had feared. Her pregnancy was in danger. The stress, the emotional turmoil, it was all taking a toll on her body. She needed to rest, to take it easy, or risk losing the baby. But how could she rest when everything around her was falling apart? The doctor's warning echoed in Sarah's mind long after she left the clinic. She needed to rest, to take care of herself and the baby, but how could she when her entire world was unraveling? Every corner of the estate seemed to suffocate her with its secrets, and the weight of everything that had happened pressed down harder every day. Back at the house, Linda remained distant, her heartbreak palpable. She went about her duties mechanically, barely acknowledging Sarah's presence. It hurt more than Sarah had expected. The person who had always been her support now seemed unreachable, lost in her own grief and sense of betrayal. That evening, Sarah sat at the kitchen table, absently staring out the window. The sky was dark, clouds rolling in from the sea, a storm brewing. She could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. Everything felt like it was on the edge of collapse. Oliver hadn't spoken to her much since she told him about the pregnancy. He spent most of his time locked in his studio, his mood dark and brooding. The guilt gnawed at Sarah, but more than that, the uncertainty. What was he thinking? Did he regret everything? Did he even want to be a father? As if drawn by her thoughts, Oliver appeared in the doorway, his expression tense. He stepped into the kitchen slowly, the silence between them heavy. Sarah looked up at him, her heart racing. "We need to talk," Oliver said, his voice low, almost hesitant. Sarah nodded, her hands trembling slightly. "I know." He sat down across from her, his gaze fixed on the table as if the words he needed to say were too hard to face. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the sound of the rain beginning to patter against the windows filling the silence. "I've been thinking," Oliver finally said, his voice strained, "about all of this. About what happens now." Sarah's stomach twisted with anxiety. She had been waiting for this conversation, dreading it. "And," Oliver sighed, running a hand through his hair. He looked tired, worn down by the weight of everything. "I didn't expect this, Sarah. I didn't expect to be in this situation. With you." His words stung, but Sarah forced herself to stay calm. "I didn't expect this either, Oliver. But it's happening." He nodded, his gaze softening slightly. "I know, and I want to do the right thing. But I don't know what that is." "I don't either," Sarah admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But we can't keep pretending this will go away. I'm pregnant, Oliver, and we need to figure out what that means for us." Oliver's eyes darkened with something Sarah hadn't seen before, a mixture of fear and sadness. "I'm still dealing with my own demons, Sarah. I lost Lily, and I'm not sure I'm ready to face fatherhood, especially not now." His admission hit Sarah like a blow to the chest. She knew he carried the pain of his wife's death with him, that it had shaped him in ways she couldn't fully understand. But this wasn't just about him anymore. There was a child growing inside her, a child who needed both of them, regardless of their fears. "I get that," Sarah said quietly, trying to hold back her own tears. "But this baby is real, and we don't have the luxury of waiting until we're ready." Oliver looked at her, his face etched with conflict. "Do you think I can be a good father? After everything I've been through?" Sarah swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his question. She didn't know the answer. She had seen the vulnerability in him, the pain that lingered from losing his wife. but she had also seen his capacity for love, for tenderness. "I think you can be," she said softly, "but you have to want it, Oliver. This isn't something you can do halfway." Oliver nodded, his expression distant. "You're right." The conversation left a heaviness between them, but there was no clear resolution. They both knew that, despite their feelings for each other, the road ahead was uncertain and filled with challenges neither of them had prepared for. It wasn't just about their relationship anymore. It was about the life they had created, the future that was now tied to their choices. As the days went on, the tension in the house grew unbearable. Sarah's health remained fragile, and Linda, still reeling from the truth, hovered between worry for her niece and her own sense of betrayal. The distance between them was painful, but neither seemed to know how to bridge it. One evening, while Sarah lay in bed, trying to rest as the doctor had advised, Linda knocked softly on her door. Sarah sat up, surprised. It had been days since her aunt had come to her room. "Come in," Sarah said, her voice hesitant. Linda stepped inside, her face lined with fatigue and sadness. She sat on the edge of the bed, looking at Sarah with eyes that seemed to carry the weight of the world. "I've been thinking," Linda began, her voice quiet. "About everything." Sarah remained silent, waiting for whatever was coming next. "I was so angry at you," Linda admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "Angry at both of you. I felt betrayed, like I didn't know either of you anymore. But you're my niece. I've loved you since you were a child, and I can't turn my back on you now, especially not when you need me." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as her aunt's words sank in. "I'm so sorry, Aunt Linda. I never wanted to hurt you." Linda sighed, brushing a strand of hair behind Sarah's ear. "I know, and I know you didn't plan for any of this to happen, but it has, and now we have to face it." The two sat there in silence for a while, the tension between them easing slightly, though the pain of everything that had happened still lingered. "What are you going to do?" Linda finally asked, her voice filled with concern. "I don't know," Sarah admitted, her voice shaky. "Oliver, he's struggling with this. He's still grieving his wife, and now, this? I don't know if he's ready." Linda's expression softened with understanding. "He's been through a lot, but you both have a responsibility now. This baby is coming, whether he's ready or not." "I know," Sarah whispered, feeling the weight of those words pressed down on her. Linda squeezed her hand gently. "Whatever happens, I'm here for you, Sarah. We'll get through this. I don't know how, but we will." The following week, everything came to a head. There was a gallery opening in the city, one that Oliver had been preparing for over the last several months. His return to the art world was supposed to be a triumphant moment for him, but now it was clouded by the storm brewing in his personal life. Still, the event went forward as planned, and Sarah found herself accompanying him, though the unease between them hadn't dissipated. The gallery was filled with people, art critics, patrons, and friends of Oliver who had come to see his latest work. Sarah stayed by his side, though the tension between them was palpable. She could feel the weight of the secret they had been carrying, and it seemed like only a matter of time before everything unraveled. And unravel it did. Midway through the evening, one of the guests, a longtime friend of Oliver's, pulled him aside. Sarah watched from a distance as the man said something to Oliver that made his face pale. She couldn't hear the conversation, but she saw the way Oliver stiffened, his hands clenching at his sides. Moments later, Oliver returned to her, his face ashen. "They know," he whispered, his voice tight with panic. Sarah's heart dropped. "What?" "Someone found out about us." "About the baby," Oliver said, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for an escape. "They're talking." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. The walls of the gallery seemed to close in on her, the whispers of the guests now deafening in her ears. She could see the glances people were throwing their way, the hushed conversations that stopped whenever they passed. "What are we going to do?" Sarah whispered, her voice filled with fear. Oliver took a deep breath, his jaw clenched. "There's only one thing we can do." He turned toward the crowd, his eyes locking onto the people who had gathered around his work. With a deep breath, he stepped forward, his voice rising above the murmur of the room. "I need to make an announcement," Oliver said, his voice calm but firm. The crowd quieted, turning toward him with curious expressions. Sarah felt her heart pounding in her chest, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. What was he doing? Oliver's eyes scanned the room before they settled on her. "There's something you all need to know," he said, his voice steady. "Sarah and we're expecting a child." The words hung in the air like a bomb, the shockwaves rippling through the crowd as gasps and whispers erupted. Sarah felt her knees go weak, her entire body trembling. This was it, the moment she had feared. Oliver's face was pale, but his expression was resolute. He had made the decision to go public with their relationship, to face the consequences head-on. There was no turning back now. The air in the gallery was thick with stunned silence. Sarah's heart raced as Oliver's words echoed through the room, each one landing like a stone in a still pond, sending ripples of shock and disbelief through the gathered crowd. She could feel the weight of 100 eyes on her, their judgment palpable. Whispers filled the space, quiet but sharp, cutting through the tension like knives. For a moment, Sarah wanted to run, to disappear, to hide from the consequences of their actions, from the reality that had finally caught up to them. But as she stood there, frozen in place, Oliver reached out and took her hand, grounding her in the chaos. His grip was firm, his eyes unwavering. He had made his choice, their choice, and there was no going back. Oliver turned to face the crowd again, his voice steady but low, addressing the stunned faces in the room. "I know this is unexpected," he said, his eyes scanning the room. "And I know what you're all thinking. But this is happening. Sarah and we're together and we're going to have a child." The crowd remained silent, the tension almost unbearable. But then, from the back of the room, someone spoke up. "Oliver, what about Lily?" It was one of his longtime friends, a man named Mark, his voice filled with confusion. "What about your wife?" Oliver's jaw tightened at the mention of Lily's name, but he didn't flinch. He turned to face Mark, his expression a mix of regret and resolution. "Lily will always be a part of me," he said quietly, "but she's gone, and she's been gone for a long time. I've spent years mourning her, years trying to live with the pain of losing her, but I'm still here, and I have to live my life. Sarah and we didn't plan for this to happen, but it did, and now we have to move forward." The room remained quiet, the weight of Oliver's words settling over everyone like a heavy fog. For a moment, no one spoke, no one moved, but slowly, the whispers began again, softer this time. As people exchanged looks, processing the revelation, Sarah felt herself trembling, her hand still tightly wrapped in Oliver's. She could barely breathe, the weight of the moment crushing her. But when she looked up at Oliver, she saw something she hadn't seen in him before. Strength. A resolve that hadn't been there before. He was choosing her. He was choosing their child. But the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. She knew that. The days after the gallery opening were a whirlwind. Word spread quickly, and soon enough, everyone in their small town knew about the scandal. The gossip was relentless. Whispers in the grocery store, stares on the streets, hushed conversations behind closed doors. Sarah felt the weight of it everywhere she went. But what hurt the most was the quiet disappointment in her aunt's eyes every time they crossed paths. Linda had always been her rock, her source of comfort and guidance, but now there was a rift between them that Sarah wasn't sure how to bridge. One evening, as Sarah sat on the porch, staring out at the darkening sky, her aunt joined her, sitting quietly beside her. "I don't know what to say anymore," Linda finally said, breaking the heavy silence. "I've been trying to wrap my head around everything. About you and Oliver. About the baby." Sarah felt her throat tighten. "I'm sorry, Aunt Linda. I never wanted to hurt you." Linda sighed, her hands folded in her lap. "I know you didn't, but this is a lot to process. You're so young, Sarah. And Oliver, he's been through so much. I just worry that you're both not ready for this." "I'm not sure we are either," Sarah admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But we don't have a choice now. This baby is coming, and we have to figure it out." Linda nodded slowly, her eyes filled with sadness. "You're right. And as much as I hate what's happened, you're still my niece. I love you, Sarah, and I'll be here for you, no matter what." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, her heart aching with a mix of relief and guilt. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. Linda reached out, squeezing her hand gently. "But I need you to understand something," she said softly. "This isn't just about you and Oliver anymore. It's about that child. You need to be sure that this is what you want, that you're both committed to making this work." "I know," Sarah said, wiping at her tears. "We're going to try." As the months passed, the initial shock of their relationship slowly began to fade. The scandal still lingered, of course, but people moved on, distracted by other gossip, other dramas. Sarah's pregnancy advanced, and with it, the reality of her situation became impossible to ignore. The changes in her body, the weight of the baby growing inside her. It was all real now, and there was no turning back. Oliver was there, though still battling his own demons. He tried, in his own way, to support Sarah, but the weight of his past was always present. He spent long hours in his studio, painting, losing himself in his art as a way to cope with the overwhelming emotions swirling inside him. One evening, as Sarah rested on the couch, her hand on her growing belly, Oliver joined her, sitting beside her in the dim light of the living room. He was quiet for a long time, staring at the floor, his brow furrowed in thought. "I've been thinking about something," he finally said, breaking the silence. Sarah turned to him, her heart skipping a beat. "What is it?" Oliver sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I need to stop hiding." Sarah frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" "I've been hiding behind my art, behind my grief for so long," he said quietly. "But I can't do that anymore. I have a responsibility now. To you. To our child. I can't keep running from this." Sarah felt a surge of hope, but also caution. She had seen Oliver struggle with the weight of his emotions, and she knew how deeply his past still affected him. But hearing him say this, seeing the determination in his eyes, gave her a glimmer of hope for their future. "I want to be a good father," Oliver continued, his voice trembling slightly. "I don't know if I can be, but I want to try." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she reached out, taking his hand in hers. "That's all I want, Oliver. I just want us to try." The months passed quickly, and soon enough, the day arrived. Sarah went into labor on a stormy night, the wind howling outside as the rain beat down on the windows. Oliver stayed by her side throughout the long hours, his face pale with fear and anticipation. Linda was there too, her presence a comforting reminder that, despite everything, Sarah wasn't alone. After what felt like an eternity, their child was born. A baby girl, tiny and perfect, her cries filling the room as the storm raged outside. The moment Sarah held her daughter in her arms, all the fear, all the uncertainty, melted away. This was real. This was her child, their child, and nothing else mattered. Oliver stood by the bed, staring down at the baby with wide eyes, his expression a mix of awe and disbelief. He reached out slowly, his hand trembling as he touched his daughter's tiny fingers. "She's beautiful," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Sarah smiled through her tears, her heart swelling with love for the tiny life in her arms. "She is." For a long moment, they stayed like that, the three of them, a family bound together by love, pain, and the promise of a future they had yet to build. In the weeks that followed, life settled into a new rhythm. The scandal that had once consumed their lives faded into the background, replaced by the day-to-day challenges of parenthood. Oliver struggled at times, still grappling with the grief of his past, but he was there. He was trying, and that was enough. Linda, true to her word, was a constant presence, helping Sarah navigate the challenges of motherhood with patience and love. The bond between them, once strained by the weight of their choices, slowly began to heal, mended by the shared love for the new life they were all now responsible for. As Sarah rocked her baby girl to sleep one quiet evening, the world outside calm and still, she felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. The road ahead would be difficult, she knew that, but for the first time in months, she felt ready to face whatever came next. She looked over at Oliver, who sat nearby, watching their daughter with a soft smile on his face. There was still so much they had to work through, so much pain and uncertainty, But they had made it this far, and they would keep going, together. And for now, that was enough. Don't miss out on more gripping stories filled with drama, suspense, and unexpected twists. Subscribe now to stay updated with our latest tales that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Join us for exclusive content and be the first to dive into new, thrilling adventures.